Hello and good morning from New York. I'm Shakuntala Santharan, Shax for short. Welcome to the launch of the 2022 Multidimensional Poverty Index, the MPI, by the UNDP's Human Development Report Office and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI for short. Today is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, a very apt day for this annual report to be released. The MPI provides a comprehensive picture of acute multidimensional poverty in over 100 countries. When most people think about poverty, they think only of monetary poverty, but people's lives are multifaceted, and there are so many other factors that should be considered, including access to education, to health, and living standards. The MPI can help support efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal to eradicate poverty. Countries have used the MPI to help get resources to where they're most needed. We have an information-packed hour for you. We start our program with a keynote address by UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner. Then we'll meet the team behind this year's report. They'll share some of their key findings with us. And we'll discuss the relevance and significance of the report with our expert panel. If you have questions for our panelists or the team behind the report, please send them via the question and answer box in the Zoom webinar, and our team will answer your questions as soon as they can. You can follow all MPI-related news online at hdr.undp.org and ophi.org.uk. and on Twitter at HDRUNDP and at OPHI_Oxford, #multidimensional poverty. You can download the report from the website of UNDP's Human Development Report Office, hdr.undp.org. Without further ado, it's my pleasure now to welcome UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner to give us his keynote address. Sir.
Thank you, Shax, and welcome to our distinguished panelists and to all who are dialing in today on the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, as you said, Shax. And I think it bears spending a moment on reflecting on the fact that for years we have been celebrating the decrease of poverty across the world. And in that sense, we have also been able to provide the world with, let's say, a message of hope that development pays off. It actually makes a lot of people escape absolute poverty when investments in education, in health, and infrastructure are made. But here we are in the midst of yet the tail end of a pandemic, hopefully a tail end, with all the socioeconomic consequences. We find ourselves in the midst of a cost of living crisis, exploding conflicts and wars across the world, and also an economic outlook that for many developing nations who are at the forefront, particularly least developed countries, of eradicating poverty, actually find themselves very constrained. In a report just last week released by UNDP, we identified 54 countries who are now facing debt distress. That means they are, in essence, a step away from not being able to service their international debt, to be able to raise money on capital markets, and yet they are already faced with fiscal constraints because of the pandemic and all that it implied. We are in a very serious situation. It is something that UNDP's Human Development Report, launched a few weeks ago, confirmed when it showed that for 2 years running, for the first time in its 30 years of reporting, actually indicated that the Human Development Index was regressing, and virtually across every country in the world, also wealthier countries. So this is a very different and difficult context in which to try and address the issue of poverty eradication. The harsh truth is that the number of people living in extreme poverty is going up day by day, and with the economic crisis, a potential global recession, this is going to get worse. That is why we need smart data. Governments need to make hard decisions. Budgetary constraints clearly dictate those, but also an understanding of what it means to invest in an urban versus a rural area, for men and versus women, for young versus older people, trying to understand how social safety nets are a vital part of enabling a society to weather a storm and not simply look at macroprudential stability, as it is often referred to, which is how the financial markets work. This has been also the focus of last week's IMF World Bank meetings. And let's be clear, it was a sobering outlook and also a world struggling with itself to come together to actually mount a response that will avoid the kind of catastrophic impacts on poor people across the world. The MPI, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, has been a way of trying to better understand how to both eradicate poverty, help people to escape poverty, but also prevent people from falling back into poverty. It has always taken as a departure point the notion that income is one reference point, but it is in no way the all-defining reality of understanding poverty. And particularly in this year's MPI report, we see also a further progression in the analysis. So-called bundles are identified where we recognize that we can both understand poverty through particular entry points, but we always have to understand also what are the policy measures that we can take, which actually might begin from a very different end. For instance, addressing sanitation in Nepal, interesting enough, produced less child mortality, better incomes, and people's access to clean drinking water, in turn being able to affect the poverty levels in communities. But it is in the way that you design such a measure that you ultimately also ensure that it has an impact on people's livelihoods in a broader sense. Much of what we see in this year's MPI is about how smart data can inform more targeted interventions by governments, but also how international development partners can assist governments in this critical phase that they're now in of increasing poverty numbers, enormous fiscal constraints, no money in government budgets, and possibly also a debt crisis unfolding. All of this, dear colleagues, comes on top of a catastrophic challenge on climate change. So again, a very important aspect of the MPI is to demonstrate that sometimes investing in clean energy technology, which may be driven by the objective of decarbonization, is actually principally and first and foremost an investment in access to clean and affordable electricity. One of the major drivers of development, one of the major pivot points for poor people to have more agency about how they can escape that fate of poverty, as it is often described. So let me end, Jacques, by just saying we have a fantastic panel, an extraordinarily important report at a very, very volatile moment in history, both for poverty eradication, but also for the way that development can counter some of these very grave threats to hundreds of millions of people, which is why UNDP takes the occasion of the launch of this year's MPI so extremely seriously and appeals really to the world at large to look at this smarter data approach, because it is one antidote from finding ourselves in an even more, let's say, problematic and for many people catastrophic situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Achim. And now let's take a look at what multidimensional poverty looks like in numbers globally. Let's hear now from the authors of this year's MPI report. Joining us, we have Tasneem Mirza, who is policy specialist at the UNDP's Human Development Report Office, and Sabina Al-Kaya, director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at Oxford University. Tasneem, if we could start with you, please. What is the global MPI?
So the MPI complements monetary-based measures of poverty to look into the daily deprivations that people experience in their lives. in the areas of health, education, and living standards. So we look at 10 specific indicators. Each of these indicators is binary, so it takes a value of 0 or 1. So for example, a person will be considered deprived in nutrition if someone within their household is underweight, or a person could be considered deprived in electricity if the household does not have access to electricity. So once we understand the deprivations in each of these indicators, then we give the person a deprivation score. And when the deprivation score is 1/3 or higher, the person is considered multidimensionally poor. And the way the MPI is calculated is it considers not only the share of poor people, but also their average deprivation score. And the index, we get a value of 0 to 1, higher decimals indicating higher levels of poverty. Now, let me share with you what this means in a real person's life. Fania is from Eastern Madagascar. She lives in a small town next to a rainforest and a national park. As you can see, the house that she lives in is built of mud walls. The roof leaks when it rains, and the house does not keep them adequately warm. They do not have access to electricity in the house. For lighting, the family uses kerosene lamps. There is no water access, but they use the nearby streams from the forest. And they also do not have a toilet, so the family uses nearby bushes. Now, Fania hasn't had a lot of education. She knows how to read and how to write. Her eldest son dropped out of school in grade 3 and now works in the town as a night guard. Between what she earns breaking rocks and her son, the family doesn't meet the nutritional needs with their earnings. So based on what I have just described, Fania is deprived in 9 out of the 10 indicators of the MPI. This gives her a deprivation score of 83%, and she's considered to be severely multidimensionally poor.
Thank you for explaining that so clearly for us, Tasneem. Now, the title of the 2022 MPI report is Understanding Deprivation Bundles. What does that mean?
So people experience multiple deprivations, and we analyze that in the report. As an example, in Sub-Saharan Africa, if we look at the top 20 profiles, here we see that in this chart, we have approximately half of the region covered. And we see that Fania's profile is in fact not that uncommon. It's the 3rd most common profile in Sub-Saharan Africa, where 3.7% of the population have exactly that same profile. And if we look at the most common profile, that's 5.9% of Sub-Saharan Africa, they are deprived in all of the 6 living standard indicators. And this deprivation of in the standards of living across Sub-Saharan Africa is actually quite common if you look across. And now if we compare that to South Asia, we see a very different picture. A poor person is much less likely to be deprived in access to drinking water or electricity compared to a multidimensionally poor person in Sub-Saharan Africa. But in South Asia, if we look at the nutrition, we see that the challenges here has been persistent. It's one of the regions that is home to the largest share of malnourished and stunted children.
So what does this mean then for policymakers? How useful are these deprivation bundles for policymakers?
So in our analysis, we find that deprivations tend to overlap. For example, 50% of the poor are jointly deprived in cooking fuel and electricity. And intervention in energy here will be important. Or 40% of the poor are jointly deprived in drinking water and sanitation. And across the globe, we see a lot of interventions in WASH. So when governments understand these deprivations, they are able to target better. And as Akim mentioned, we saw this in the case of Nepal, where the government wanted to address the issue of malnourishment in children under 5. And the way they did this is they not only invested in nutrition and food security, but they also invested heavily in sanitation, which then improved the quality of drinking water, reduced incidences of diarrhea, and had a large impact on child nutrition and mortality. So when governments are able to see the deprivations and link them, they can make much more effective and smarter interventions.
Thank you very much, Tasneem. Now, Sabina, where are the poor according to this latest MPI?
So the Global MPI 2022 covers 6 billion people in 111 countries, and 1.2 billion of them are multidimensionally poor. And of those, sadly, half are children. 1 in 3 children are poor, but 1 in 7 adults. In terms of where they live, 83% are in rural areas, and 83% are also in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But this year, fewer people in South Asia, in part because of the strong reduction, for example, in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, but also because the data are newer. So there may have been changes not yet visible in Africa. These numbers come out, and yet it's important to let them sink in. They should not be what Amartya Sen referred to as a calamity to which the world has somewhat incredibly gotten coolly accustomed. Rather, especially because they probably underestimate poverty, they must be a challenge for us to address with the sharper tools of deprivation bundles and other kinds of tools.
Can you tell us about poverty reduction trends, Sabina, at least before they were impacted, set back by the COVID pandemic?
Yes, so this year we cover 81 countries and over 5 billion people. And 72 of those countries had a statistically significant reduction in one period. Central Africa and Guinea had an increase. When the Sustainable Development Goals suggest people to step up outside institutional silos, it's because sometimes synergistic policies have an impact. And we found that of those 72 countries, 68 reduced deprivations in 5 or more indicators, 46 countries in 8 or more, 26 in all included indicators. So there was evidence that synergistic approaches were of interest, but it's not all good news. So of the 80 countries we cover, 81, in 40, half of them, children either had 0 reduction of poverty or they reduced more slowly than adults, and they are poorer. Also, before the pandemic, we had done a simulation at the very beginning showing that probably the pandemic was going to set poverty reduction trends back by 3 to 10 years. The updated data are showing that the setback is likely at the high end of that difficulty.
Sabina, what data was used to compute this latest MPI? How recent is the data?
So we're very grateful to UNICEF with the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey and USAID with the demographic and health surveys that we use for 99 countries, and national data providers and PAPFAM we use for 13. And the updated estimates are for 12 countries, half in Latin America plus India. We added 3 new countries, including Samoa and Tuvalu, small island developing states, an important group. And of the poor people, although the data go from 2010 to 2021, 83% of poor people have data from 2016 or later, and 37% from 2019 or later. But there's a problem. And the problem is that our data do not represent the post-pandemic situation. The Sustainable Development Goals called for a data revolution. And we hoped that after 2015, that vertical line, we would see a stark increase in the frequency of the household surveys, but we're not seeing that. And just to put a point on it, our 3 poorest countries are Niger, South Sudan, and Burkina Faso. And their data are from 2010 to 2012. And they're home to 50 million poor people. We have monetary data on billionaires every hour. And so the report calls for the data revolution not to leave poverty data behind.
Between these data gaps and child poverty, this is painting a really gloomy picture. Is there any cause for hope?
There are many stories that we can pull out. For example, 12 of the 20 countries to reduce multidimensional poverty fastest were in Africa. And there are many countries that had pro-poorest trends. But one that we signal in this report is the experience of India. From 2005-6 to 2019 to 21, India reduced multidimensional poverty from 55.1% to 16.4%. 415 million people came out of poverty, 275 million in the first decade, 140 subsequently. And there were pro-poorest trends across social groups and absolute reductions. And so that's a positive setting. All 10 indicators reduced significantly. Cooking fuel, sanitation, housing were very strong. But again, these data don't reflect the post-pandemic situation. And even then, 229 million people remained poor in India, 97 million children. So our hope is that these data and these new tools will be useful indeed also in this context.
Sabina and Tasneem, thank you very much both for helping us understand some of the wealth of data in your report. And now here's a short video summary of more of the main findings of this year's MPI report. To help us digest the findings and better understand the relevance of the MPI, we're joined in the studio again by UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner and OPHI's Director Sabina Al-Khair. And joining us online is Her Excellency Hala Helmi El Sayed, who is Minister of Planning and Economic Development of Egypt. She joins us from Cairo in Egypt. Dr. Luis Felipe Lopez Calva is Global Director of the Poverty and Equity Global Practice of the World Bank Group. He joins us from Washington, D.C. And Her Excellency Aminata Toure, who is former Prime Minister of Senegal, joins us from Dhaka in Senegal. Thank you all very much for being here with us. Let's start with a question for everyone. In one sentence, what's the most striking takeaway for you from this year's MPI report? If we could start with you, please, Achim.
Well, perhaps something that is self-evident, but you have to then unbundle it or even bundle it, as the report says, which is that there are many factors that drive poverty and keep people in poverty and even make people fall back into poverty. And it is that which the MPI allows us to recognize much more clearly, that there are ways in which we can develop much more integrated responses and therefore achieve much greater returns on poverty reduction investments.
And Sabina, what about you as one of the authors of the report?
What surprised me is that if you look at all of the interconnected indicators, you might want a bundle that was prominent, but that there was no magic bundle. There was no one bundle that really took care of everything. So you do have to go country by country, region and group by group. But when you do that, then you can get traction. Then you can see some commonalities and plan some responses.
Minister El Sayed, what about you? What stood out for you in this year's report?
Well, let me start first by congratulating us all on today's launch. And I, of course, acknowledge the role of the Multidimensional Poverty Index in supporting all the objectives of the multidimensional poverty in over 100 countries. I'd like to congratulate and thank the OPHI and the UNDP for their commitment. Let me, as you mentioned, the most striking takeaway is the prevalence of child poverty. As illustrated, half of the poor worldwide are children, under the age of 18. 1 in 3 children, as have been mentioned, lives in poverty compared with 1 in 7 adults. We are definitely aware that the world's crises have greatest impact on young people. However, there are also the ones with the boldest ideas, and they are the ones that drive and create a better society for our future.
Luis Felipe, what stands out most for you?
Thank you. So it's an honor to be part of this panel. I will start saying first that it's important to say that there is an intellectual victory that has to be claimed by UNDP and OPHI. I think the fact that we all now work on the idea of poverty as being multidimensional, it's a very important intellectual victory that now turns into better policy. So I want to start by acknowledging that. Second, in terms of the report, I really want to say that, well, this is, as we have said recently, a wake-up call for policymakers around the world. The eradication of poverty is a complex phenomenon in its multidimensionality. So it cannot be achieved while in the short term, for the emergency, cash transfers played a very important role. That is not enough. We need a coordinated action across different sectors in the state. And for that, these numbers, this report, this approach has already paid off in terms of coordinated action, very concrete examples around the world from which we can learn and continue to strengthen.
Dr. Toure, what is your biggest takeaway?
Well, I'm a very optimistic person, so I was glad to hear that 12 out the 20 countries who reduced fastly poverty are from Africa, because I think that's always the balance that this report is trying to bring. Being very honest about the situation internationally, but at the same time, showing progress. I think it's very important to show progress. We've been in this business for so long. And I was also sort of a little bit disappointed when we are talking about all the data. Africa has suffered a lot from this lack of data. I was happy to hear the word data revolution, because we have seen progresses in Africa in many parts. At the same time, we are struggling with new challenges that came out of the post-COVID period. So I think we need to sort of see that balance being clearly sort of shown, so we don't look like we are sort of pedaling in a vacuum. People are trying to move forward. Countries, I'm talking from where I am in Africa. I mean, we have seen important increase in economic growth. And that brings me to one point that we need to discuss. When we are poor and multidimensionally, that's because most of the time those people don't have cash, they don't have incomes, not sufficient income. So we have to tie all the issue we are talking about to economic development, to economic growth. If we don't do that, we are looking at the consequences of a bigger problem, which is the lack of economic prospect for the poorest. And I think it's very important that we see that very much being laid out in the report. The other point I would like also to pinpoint is to say that these people sometimes become poor multidimensionally because of peace issues, conflict issues, climate impact issues. So that also has to be bring into the bigger picture. So when we look at solution, we can also have multi-dimension solution too. So data collection is something that we really need to work strongly. Impulsing economic growth, we need, I believe, a new international deal to end poverty. As human beings, the world has the means to end poverty. We do know that. We have to show also that. Sometimes it's also a matter of political will. And that's where UNDP comes in and the United Nations comes in, is to bring all the countries around the table so they can show the money for international development to preserve peace also. So the consequences also of having a huge bulk of people being multidimensionally poor is also a security issue for everyone. So that ties also the issue to migration. In West Africa, younger people tend to want to cross the desert and be directly in Europe. So how are we going to make sure that we build an international solidarity system so we address that? And lastly, poverty is not only about developing countries. You have to look it also into very developed countries. I lived a lot. I lived for quite some years in the USA, and I did my studies in Europe. I think poor people in those countries needs also, advocates, because I think poverty is a human dignity issue. So no matter where you live, and I think it might be even more difficult to bear when you live in a wealthy environment to be multidimensionally poor. So I think it's good to bring, the poverty issues as we see it in different parts of the world, but let's make sure we bring it as one, and we bring then the human rights issues, whether you're from Nepal or you're from Senegal or you're from the USA or the south of USA, you need to access minimum standards of health, of education and income. That's what I wanted to say at this point in time.
Thank you, Dr. Toure. Now, the MPI shows that 1.2 billion people live in multidimensional poverty. Ahim, why is it important for governments to be tracking the MPI?
First of all, I think we need to begin where our fellow panelists were also pointing to, that this is actually a product of human failure or human negligence. We live in an era where, as a global economy, even as nations, this is a number that should really shame us, because it is neither the price for development, the long argument of a trickle-down view of development, that this is just the time that you have to wait until people catch up. No, these are the products of policy failures or deliberate policy oversights, blind spots. Many countries, and this is in part also where we come back to the MPI. Yes, it is also a matter of data. You need to know who are the poor, what are the main drivers that affect them, and how can you then design with intentionality policies to address. I'm sure Hala will speak to that in a moment, because this is one of the programs she has launched in Egypt also, which is you essentially find the poor and you then work with them. You give them agency. It may be cash, it may be education, it may be clean water, it may be access to electricity. There are many factors that can bring poverty down. But perhaps what is most egregious about this number is what Dr. Toure also pointed out just now, and Professor Hala, that these are in overwhelming numbers young people. And the cost to a nation's development is extraordinary, because this is where sometimes our financial economy is such a parallel universe to the economy of a poor person. Financial markets recover. Remember 2008? The indices on Wall Street and elsewhere had recovered within 12 months while people were still going bankrupt. A child that is malnourished, a child that has not received education, a child that grows up in destitution, essentially carries the price of that for the rest of his or her life. While in the financial world, we sort of move on. And this is where we need to bring that view of how governments can correct for what is not just a market failure, but a policy failure. And as I think we all sense, at the end of the day, poverty puts our own societies and progress into jeopardy, because at some point, inequality becomes a real cancer in societies. And I think this is why this number matters. Almost a fifth of humanity in the year 2022. And we are just witnessing how the world is not able to respond as an international community to the opportunity to actually mitigate this crisis right now.
Now, Minister Al-Sayed, Egypt has done well before in global MPI reduction from 2008 to 2014. As Ahim just mentioned, your country is finalizing its own national MPI. How has it helped you as minister to address poverty in your country?
Indeed, the measurement of the poverty in monetary terms via income or consumption only narrows the definition of poverty. which is now we're talking about the multidimensional poverty, which is a multifaceted phenomenon. It addresses more the basic services. Now, when we launched the Haya Karima initiative, the Decent Life initiative, which I think Mr. Akram is referring to, this was basically based on the multidimensional poverty, access to for people to different basic services. As you're aware, and as you mentioned, Egypt has been successful in decreasing this in terms of the huge population Egypt has. However, we were successful in decreasing this a few years ago, between 8% to 4.9%. However, now what we are looking for is more in-depth analysis of this in order to reflect the impact of the policies that we're doing. We have the Decent Life initiative, which is basically providing a better quality of services, sanitation, clean water, decent housing, fiber optics, micro projects and microfinance to people across the 4,500 villages. In addition, and we're aligning this with the family development program that is basically investing in the characteristics of people through women economic empowerment and raising the awareness of women to the importance of quality of people rather than having more people with less quality.
Thank you, Minister. Now, amid those stark numbers in the report, India stands out by having successfully reduced some of its poverty. Sabina, you were sharing some of that data with us earlier. Can you tell us any more about that?
Yeah, so the headline that we were trying to unpack is how it reduced poverty by 415 million people in 15 years. And we looked at 15 years because the Sustainable Development Goals call on countries to cut their multidimensional poverty by half in that time period. And India did. It cut its multidimensional poverty value and the percentage of people by half. And the SDGs called to leave no one behind. So whether it was the poorest states like Bihar reduced poverty from 77% in 2005-06 to 52% in 15-16 to 37% in 35% in 2019-21. And so there's some pro-poorest trends we need to learn from. And yet there's still some raw challenges with 90% of the poor living in rural areas. But children in India did have a stronger reduction of poverty, a faster reduction than adults. There's also ongoing challenges. While the group of poverty reduced greatly, the people who are vulnerable, who have between 20 and 33% of deprivations, it's the same. It didn't go down. It didn't increase, but it didn't go down. But in this current period, 2/3 of them are also deprived in nutrition. And so there's a big problem of food security that's probably been exacerbated. So I think we need to learn what went right, because 400 million people is a big number and 1.2 billion people is a big number. But this example, we need to study, unpack, learn from, because it can provide insights for other regions.
Important lessons.
Yeah.
Now, this year's report shows that the largest group of multidimensionally poor live in sub-Saharan Africa, 579 million people. Although that may be due partly to older data, still approximately 53% of people in that region are multidimensionally poor. Dr. Toure, in your opinion, how can sub-Saharan Africa become a success in poverty reduction?
Well, first of all, the debate is uneasy because you started by saying that the statistics are not good. As scientists, we work with statistics. So what we're going to say has to be quote to quote. And I challenge the United Nations Statistic Bureau to come up with better results. I mean, statistic from 2012 for Burkina Faso won't make it. So that's my first statement about that. Because I have been Prime Minister, I've seen on my own eyes progress being made, but if it is not recorded in statistic, then we're talking about the past, we are not talking about the present. So that's also a challenge for UNDP in terms of supporting the countries, but we have to do our own work. We're not gonna run away from that. Countries, African countries, need to come up with good statistics because it has a cost when you have old statistics. When you go on the financial market, you present an image that is not accurate. So, you're borrowing at higher rates, et cetera, et cetera. Investors are reluctant to come. I have, for instance, nice stories that we never talk about. In Senegal, we are 97% Muslim. And this year, consequently, last year it was the same situation. We had more girls sitting for exam to go to high school than boys in 2 consecutive years. But this is not recorded in statistics. So that might have an impact on multi-dimensionally being poor. But if it is not recorded, we won't see that. So, that's how we unfold as the decision makers in Africa, but that's also where we need the support to be made. But I do see 2 to 3 way of sort of making sure that we make good progress. First of all, is education, what I'm saying, investing heavily on women. The World Bank, made the case many times that women are smart economists. You're investing on them, you see a reduction of poverty. I mean, that is scientifically proven. We have to support them for their education. We have to deal with issues like early marriage. We have to address their reproductive health. We have to make sure that family planning, is available for them, especially for rural women, et cetera, et cetera. I can go on and on and on. When it comes to, keeping girls at school, we know that when women are more educated, they're more productive, they are an asset for their countries. So that is one way of doing it. And African women are doing are making progress. In Senegal, where I am, you have a 50-50 parity law at the parliament. As I speak, I'm a member of parliament. And, it brings me joy to see so many women at the parliament on an equality basis. So maybe we should also look at that route. Maybe we should invest more on that target group. The other also way of dealing with it is young people. The continent is the youngest continent in the world. 70% of the population is below the age of 35. You cannot have the ambition of reducing poverty if you don't address, young people's rights and needs. That's what brings me back to the economic prospect. We need jobs. We need jobs. We need jobs. But how are you going to create jobs? You're going to, increase investment, and you're going to, create economic growth, and then you're going to create jobs for young people. And then you're going to have a stable environment, a peaceful environment. So it's a package. Somebody talk about the bundle, of poverty, but there is a bundle for fighting poverty too. So that package, I would like to challenge scientists, researchers to come up with it. But I'm sure that within it, you will find addressing women's rights. You will find making sure that young people's become a force, a driving force for development. You would see the package the element of peace, and you would see also the element of safeguarding, in environment. So I see a bundle to address your question really, but I would see addressing strongly, the rights and needs of a pretty promising group, which is women. They are 51% of the continent. They are hard workers. We do know that they are the one working the most. I mean, there are many reports that show that. Then that might be sort of a strategy. And young people combining both target groups. I think if we invest heavily on those target groups, I am sure that we are going to have faster progress. We are making progress, but the whole strategy is how to accelerate change. I like to see that also in the reflection. We are reducing poverty as we go, but it's too slow. And when you deal with young people, you better be quick and fast, because patience is not, the strongest quality. So that's what I wanted to say. So let's think about the bundle. The bundle, of course, is the SDGs, and before that, the MDGs. But we have to come down to it, target, pinpoint, the group we want to work with. We must work with women and young people. Of course, we're gonna break them down into the rurals, into the poorest, into the most educated, the less educated, etc.
Yes, it's clear evidence that empowering women and children is a benefit to everybody. And Akim, we're getting questions from the audience about how the MPI helps shapes what the UNDP is doing on the ground.
Well, I think if you just listen to our panelists, you can see what I meant earlier on. Well-informed policymaking with intentionality and designed to actually address poverty eradication can succeed. I mean, there are programs we just heard from Minister Hala about the Decent Life Initiative in Egypt. In fact, Senegal had its own initiative called PUDC, Programme d'Urgence de Développement Communautaire. It was a program targeted specifically at accelerating poverty reduction by providing infrastructure service to the rural areas of Senegal. The Bolsa Familia of Brazil. I think, you know, our development landscape is full of examples of what can actually work. So for us in UNDP, the eradication of poverty remains a center piece of our work. And, you know, it's not only in least developed countries. In fact, most of the world's poor today, ironically, live in middle income countries. This is one of the strange contradictions we have to deal with. And therefore, poverty and inequality are central to providing development advice for countries to articulate their development pathways to address this. And MPIs are an extremely useful instrument. I mean, whether it is in India and Uganda, where for the first time UNDP accompanied countries to produce a national MPI report. I can take you to Nigeria, to Cuba, to Uzbekistan. And no doubt Sabina can do the same, because we have been partners, so to speak, in helping countries to have this instrument available. But let's also be clear, and the Secretary General, in fact, last Friday at the Development Committee of the World Bank called for an SDG stimulus in the midst of this current situation. We should be very clear that poverty eradication is, on the one hand, how you can support the poor. At the other end of the spectrum, it's how an economy can create the opportunities, the platforms, the space on which poor people are actually able to succeed. So in the way that, for example, cash transfer can be helpful, targeted programs for micro, small, medium-scale enterprises are also part of that equation, or indeed providing insurance. How many poor people lose their very savings and fall back into extreme poverty because they have no health insurance? And when a father, a mother, a daughter, a son falls ill, all savings are basically used to make treatments possible. These are the kinds of things that policy can change. And therefore, I want to just agree with all our panelists. We provide stark statistics of failure, but also in part because the contrast to this, success stories of well-designed, targeted policy interventions. And that's where UNDP continues across the 170 countries we work in the world today to focus on this.
Luis Felipe, how about the World Bank? How could the MPI inform the World Bank's efforts to eradicate poverty?
Thank you. Actually, building on what Ahim just said and the call by Dr. Touré and Sabina on data, one point is the importance of building better policy based on evidence. So I can mention, for example, that we are starting an operation led by the Poverty Practice, $600 million for the statistical capacities of Sub-Saharan Africa. But I have to say, as much as the international organizations can do, this also requires political will. So it is also in terms of the political will in the countries to really build this capacity for better data. And I think this multidimensional poverty exercise shows, as Sahim said, that policy can be improved. There is also the Multidimensional Poverty Policy Network that has shown examples of how the index can be used to have more coordinated action. But I also want to say that something that also Dr. Touré mentioned, and this is related to, of course, the multidimensional poverty approach is very important, so we can make sure that people can exercise social rights. But it's also important because we have to unleash the productive capacity of the poor. When we talk about inclusive growth, that is not going to happen as an afterthought to the process of growth. We have to actually unleash the capacity, lift all the constraints, so actually those at the bottom of the distribution can participate more proactively in the growth process. And then the result of that by construction will be a more inclusive pattern of growth. So I think investing by the state, and this is very important because one of the messages of multidimensional poverty approach is that there are many dimensions for which the markets cannot work. There are no markets. to deal with some of these specific dimensions. So we need decisive action by the state. So I think this is a call also for a commitment by the state to really engage in this multidimensional action to, at the same time, fulfill rights, but also unleash economic capacity.
Sabina, can we look at the report a little more closely for a minute here? Were there any surprises in your analysis of these deprivation bundles?
So I think that the surprise was the disparity in the differences, but I'll give an example. The most common deprivation profile, that means the most common indicators that poor people had at the same time, was nutrition, lack of good sanitation, lack of good durable housing, and clean cooking fuel. So this was already nutrition plus housing, plus living standard indicators. It was crossing dimensional boundaries. And it covered 374 million people, a third of the poor people, and 45 million were only deprived in that. But in India, 15% of the poor had that particular deprivation profile, much more than anyone else. And so that's an example where when you go from a global analysis to looking at a country, looking at rural urban areas, you can have a more textured idea of what is actionable. And the other surprise, and I would really encourage others to think about this, whether you're in private sector or a student, but it's just the mismatches. We think that a person who doesn't have 6 years of schooling will go alongside nutrition. And so we know that 595 million people live in a household where no one has 6 years of schooling, and 681 where somebody's not malnourished. So we'd think that they were mostly the same people, but it's less than half. It's 242 million. And so imagine a household with educated people, but under nutrition, or imagine a household without education, but where they're able to get by on other ways. And I think trying to put ourselves into these different experiences helps to release the kind of creativity this difficult situation so needs.
So as Sabina and Tasneem have explained, multidimensional poverty is often configured in bundles of deprivation, and the report recommends that policymakers develop integrated approaches to address poverty in their own country. Minister Al-Sayed, from your experience in Egypt, how do you design such integrated policies, and what might other countries learn from your experience?
Well, it is actually, we use this as a baseline for monitoring and evaluating the impact of different initiatives. As I said, the most notable is the Decent Life Initiative, and we have also the 100 Million Lives Initiative, which basically assesses the health system for people across Egypt, and also the Healthy Women Initiative that basically also assesses the level of health for women across Egypt. It's useful when we most use this evidence-informed policies to address demographic differences, or even the uneven distribution of resources. Sometimes when you distribute public resources, it is sometimes distributed unevenly across regions of the country. So it's important to capture the impact of this policies. And also it is very useful when we are addressed by different shocks. When now the world is basically being addressed by unprecedented and multiple shocks. So it's important that we capture the impact of shocks on living condition. It is also, it provides us with an adequate base for evaluating the impact of future shocks, and take advantage of innovative and different policy and different developmental initiatives that we have, and give us policy recommendation. So I look forward to the ongoing collaboration between, of course, the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development and the UNDP, and also with the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, to develop our MPI that will provide us with a comprehensive picture to the acute multidimensional poverty, and will help us to address better all our policies in the future for a just and better future for our generations.
Now, the latest UNDP Human Development Report launched last month showed us that younger generations will be much more exposed to the effects of climate change, dangerous planetary change, warming climate, and staggering biodiversity loss. Now, the MPI is showing us that half of the world's multidimensionally poor are our children, as you pointed out, Sabina. Now, Dr. Toure, you highlighted started to talk about the importance of addressing child poverty. Please expand on that, because Africa is where many of these environmental effects will be very harshly felt.
Well, I would say children and young people. As I said, 70% of the population is below the age of 35. I mean, 35 is quite young. So there is no way you want to deal with any development issue if you don't target young people. I mean, common sense there, but that's not what we are seeing necessarily. So maybe let me come to the bundle of solution also, to put in front of the bundle of deprivations. I think we have to use the mechanism of the budget. We know that when you are in developing countries, everything is an emergency when it comes to budget. But I think we have to win the fight of the budget to make sure that within national budget, that's what we have done with PUDC, that Minister Administrator talked about. Every single year, the funding for, this community development project has to be, the budget has to be reflected within the national budget. So that is the first mechanism that we need to use to make sure that we do have very precise budget line to deal with this issue of multidimensionally poor people. So that has to be very clear, pinpointed. When we talk about education, what we are going to do with the poorest children who, when they finish primary school, don't go to high school because they have nowhere to live. When they leave their villages, they cannot go to the city. Then that's the end of their education. What do we do with that? We need to see a specific budget line in the Ministry of Education dealing with scholarship, dealing with maybe boarding school, etc. We have to do the same when it comes to women. Women don't access lands. They don't access necessarily, financing when it comes to developing their agricultural activities. We need to see a budget line dealing with that. We need to see in the Ministry of Health, a budget line talking about family planning. I'm a former UNFPA staff. And I know how it impacts on productivities. I would not be able to talk to you right now if I had to raise 10 children, like most of my generation women did. So how are we going to use that leverage? And that's how we can work with different actors within institutions, including the parliament. I am a member of parliament, and that is going to be my most fight, looking at the budget and seeing whether those groups, are taken care of. In Senegal, we do have what we call the national registrations for vulnerable people. So we do know where they are. So that's why when we talk about statistics, there is a disconnect, because the government invested a lot in identifying, where these vulnerable people are. But what we are missing is strategies from the ground. Everything is dealt from, from upstairs, meaning the ministry. It's a little bit politicized also, that's the truth. And then we have to bring the approach to the bottom, at the neighborhood level. We do have here in our law what we call Conseil de Quartier, which means neighborhood council, where women are represented, young people are represented, the imam is represented. That's where, those poor live in the neighborhoods, and then the strategies need to, be implemented at the bottom before they go all the way up. So I think we need to reframe the way we want to deal with poverty. Of course, a state has the authority to define, policies at the national level. But until we make sure that we strengthen, we give, needs and strength and financing to our local, mechanism, it's going to be difficult to deal, effectively with reducing, this poverty we're talking about. So that, sort of require a reframing of how we see our intervention. Of course, you have to fight the bureaucracy, because, you have to cut the transaction costs that are very, very high, in Africa. we have to tell the truth. I mean, from the minister to, the councillor with the 4x4 cars and the meetings and etc. I mean, you end up with maybe 10% of the budget being, sort of seen by beneficiaries. So, but we have to sort of go from the bottom up, as I said, and looking into how local authorities, how local governance can be strengthened to take care of these most vulnerable groups that we are talking about is something that, we need to think about, very seriously.
Please, Felipe, quickly, the MPI report is about multidimensional poverty, but can we separate that from multidimensional inequalities?
Not at all. I think actually, in a way, this is a manifestation of a broader phenomenon, which is precisely the multidimensional inequalities and the depth of those inequalities. In a way, we are zooming into a specific population group, but this is just part of a more complicated story in which inequalities have to be addressed. And I want to go back quickly as a final message to the bundle, because I think we tend to, for those countries that have more recent data, we have seen how people have fell into poverty. But please do not forget that also those who were already poor are poorer today. So this is very important. These two aspects are very important. And in order to 2 points, in terms of the bundle, I think we have to invest in those things that make people less vulnerable and those things that make people more productive. I think those should be sort of guiding principles in terms of the practical policy. At that point, we have to understand better the interactions among the dimensions. We need to understand where is the largest sort of, to put it in this way, bang for the buck, in the sense that if you invest in that dimension, that has spillover effects on other dimensions. And I think if we do that analytically, we can have also more effective interventions. Thank you.
There is so much more to discuss, but we're going to have to start wrapping things up. Can we get your closing thoughts, please, Achim?
I want to go back to this notion that, in every country there is agency. We are all entrapped in larger macroeconomic geopolitical constraints, but still, as these examples we have heard about today show, in the end, it is also about the political economy of a country. Do the poor matter? If they matter, then you begin to measure what actually defines poverty. You start investing in data. So it's a chicken and egg situation sometimes, but I think the main message from my perspective would be, if you have the intention to address this issue, and I think more and more countries have lived through shocks in recent years, that there is no alternative to addressing this issue of poverty and inequality, then you can do so. And I end with one fascinating example. In Afghanistan, after last August, we put women at the center of our response within an extremely difficult setting, because we identified that there are 50,000 women-led micro-enterprises in Afghanistan. So we knew who they were. We worked with the Women's Chamber of Commerce. We found them. We invested in them. For each one of these women who leads a micro-enterprise, they will employ 3 or 4 more people. Each of these women look after a household of maybe 7 to 10 people. That is how you begin to design, even under the most difficult circumstances, programs, as our panelists have also pointed out and could speak to with far greater authority than I can. It is that intentionality. And I hope that what we are able to achieve is not only the philosophical, the ethical narrative around poverty eradication, it is actually the fact that it can be done. So in that sense, stark statistics should not be interpreted as there is no hope. And in that sense, I think Dr. Turio was right. This report is in fact about hope if you take the issue seriously.
Thank you very much, Achim. And thank you all for your valuable insights and perspectives. Thanks to the authors of the report. You've all given us much to think about and hopefully inspired policymakers, multilateral organizations, and civil society groups with some ideas to tackle multidimensional poverty. Thank you to our global audience for joining us today. A reminder, again, you can download the report from the website of UNDP's Human Development Report Office, hdr.undp.org. From me and the team and all our panelists at UNDP,